Picture this. A teenage French princess arrives in medieval England, expecting fairy tale romance, only to discover her husband is about as mentally stable as a Windows 95 computer running modern software. So what does she do? She grabs the crown, raises armies, and proceeds to wage 22 years of civil war that makes Game of Thrones look like a neighborhood dispute. Meet Margaret of Anjou, the woman who turned England into her personal chessboard, moved kings like pawns, and earned the charming nickname She-Wolf. Spoiler alert, she didn't get that name for her nurturing maternal instinct. If you're ready to discover how one woman's refusal to play nice literally reshaped a kingdom, hit that notification bell, because this story has more plot twists than your favorite Netflix series. Let's start with a question that'll keep you up tonight. What would you do if you were 15 years old, shipped off to a foreign country to marry a complete stranger, and discovered your new husband occasionally thought he was made of glass? Because that's exactly what happened to Margaret of Anjou in 1445, and her response would make Daenerys Targaryen look like a Sunday school teacher. Margaret wasn't just any French princess. She was the daughter of Rene of Anjou, a man who collected royal titles like Pokemon cards, but had about as much actual power as a substitute teacher. Rene called himself King of Naples, Sicily, Jerusalem, and roughly half the Mediterranean. But in reality, he couldn't successfully rule a small French duchy. It's like calling yourself CEO of Apple when you actually manage a fruit stand. But here's the thing about medieval politics. It wasn't about what you had. It was about what people believed you might someday have. When English diplomats came knocking with a marriage proposal, Rene saw his chance. His teenage daughter would marry Henry II of England, and in exchange, England would help him reclaim his imaginary kingdoms. It was the medieval equivalent of a pyramid scheme, except instead of essential oils, they were trading royal bloodlines. Margaret, meanwhile, was getting the full Disney princess treatment. 15 years old, beautiful, intelligent, and raised on romantic poetry about chivalrous knights and courtly love. She probably imagined arriving in England to find her husband writing sonnets under her window, maybe organizing tournaments in her honor. The reality? Henry II was 23 years old, and had the mental fortitude of wet cardboard. Let me paint you a picture of Henry II that your history textbook definitely glossed over. This was a man who would occasionally slip into catatonic states where he couldn't recognize his own reflection. He once spent 18 months in what medieval doctors called a state of mental absence. Basically, the lights were on, but nobody was home. During these episodes, he required full-time care, couldn't make decisions, and sometimes forgot he was King of England. Imagine marrying someone thinking you're getting a partner, only to discover you've essentially adopted a very expensive pet who occasionally wears a crown. But here's where Margaret's story gets interesting, and why we're still talking about her 600 years later. Lesser people might have accepted their fate, retreated to embroidery, and lived quietly in their gilded cage. Margaret looked at this situation and thought, hold my medieval wine. The wedding itself was a spectacular affair. Henry spared no expense because, ironically, the one thing he was good at was spending money England didn't have. Margaret arrived at Westminster Abbey in April 1445, wearing cloth of gold and enough jewelry to fund a small war. The crowds cheered, the nobles bowed, and everyone pretended this was a love match, instead of a political transaction with a broken return policy. What nobody anticipated was that Margaret had been paying attention during her French upbringing. She'd watched her father navigate the treacherous world of medieval politics, seen how power shifted like quicksand, and learned that in a world where men controlled everything, a smart woman had to be twice as clever and 3 times as ruthless just to survive. The honeymoon period, if you can call it that, lasted approximately 5 minutes. Margaret quickly realized that Henry's idea of ruling a kingdom involved praying a lot and hoping problems would solve themselves. His advisors were running the country while he drifted through his days like a medieval sleepwalker. And the English nobles? They were circling like sharks who'd smelled blood in the water. This is where most fairy tales would end with, and they lived happily ever after. But Margaret's story was just beginning, because she'd made a decision that would echo through centuries. If her husband couldn't rule England, she would do it for him. The shy French princess was about to transform into something that would make her enemies wake up screaming. But first, she had to figure out how to survive in a court where everyone smiled to her face while sharpening knives behind her back. Welcome to medieval England, where the real Game of Thrones was played with actual stakes. and losing meant more than just a disappointing season finale. You know that feeling when you start a new job, and everyone's being suspiciously nice while you slowly realize the office politics are more toxic than a Chernobyl picnic? Margaret of Anjou got that crash course. Except instead of passive-aggressive emails, people expressed their displeasure with actual swords. Let's talk about what Margaret walked into. Because understanding medieval English court politics is like trying to understand cryptocurrency. It seems simple until you realize every transaction might literally kill you. England in 1445 wasn't just ruled by Henry VI. It was controlled by a delicate balance of noble families who spent their time plotting against each other with the dedication of modern conspiracy theorists. At the center of this web sat Richard, Duke of York. Picture the most ambitious person you know, multiply their ambition by about 50, give them several armies, and you're getting close to understanding York. He had a legitimate claim to the throne, arguably better than Henry's, and the patience of a saint when it came to long-term planning. York wasn't just waiting for his moment, he was carefully constructing it, brick by brick, like building a medieval Death Star. Then there was Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who controlled Henry's ear and had been essentially running England while the king stared at walls and contemplated his relationship with God. Somerset and York hated each other with the passion of rival sports fans, except their disagreements ended in battle rather than heated Twitter exchanges. Margaret, fresh off the boat from France and still figuring out that her husband's idea of decisive leadership involved asking God for signs, had to navigate between these factions, while everyone watched to see which side she'd choose. It's like being the new kid at school during a gang war, except the gangs have professional armies and family crests. What makes Margaret's early years fascinating is how quickly she learned the game. Remember, she was 15. When you were 15, you were probably worried about acne and algebra. Margaret was studying the fine art of medieval realpolitik, while planning how to secure her husband's throne, and, more importantly, her own survival. Her first major lesson came in the form of Jack Cade's rebellion in 1450. Picture this. Thousands of angry peasants and disgruntled soldiers marching on London because they were tired of high taxes, military failures in France, and general governmental incompetence. It was basically a medieval version of a very violent protest, complete with demands for governmental reform and the removal of corrupt advisors. Henry VI's response to this crisis. He ran away. Not strategically retreated, actually fled. London like it was on fire. Margaret, watching her husband's complete inability to handle the situation, had what we might call her come to Jesus moment, or in this case, her come to Margaret moment, because she realized that if anyone was going to save this monarchy, it would have to be her. The rebellion was eventually put down, but not before Jack Cade's forces had occupied London for 3 days, executed several royal officials, and generally made their point about governmental incompetence. Margaret watched this unfold and learned several crucial lessons. First, that popular support mattered. Second, that showing weakness invited attack. And third, that her husband was about as useful in a crisis as a chocolate teapot. But Margaret's real education came through watching the noble factions maneuver around Henry's increasingly obvious mental instability. When Henry had his first major mental breakdown in 1453, spending 18 months in a catatonic state where he couldn't recognize anyone or make decisions, Margaret got a front-row seat to medieval succession politics. York immediately stepped forward, claiming he should be regent during Henry's illness. It made sense, he was the senior male relative, had proven administrative ability, and wasn't currently drooling into his porridge. But Margaret had other ideas, because she'd just given birth to a son, Edward, and she wasn't about to let York position himself as the power behind the throne. This is where Margaret began showing the steel that would define her reign. While Henry sat in his chambers, unresponsive to the world around him, Margaret organized the court opposition to York's regency. She built alliances, made promises, and demonstrated a political acumen that would have impressed Machiavelli if he'd been born yet. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers. The French princess, married into the English royal family as a decorative alliance sealer, was proving to be the most politically astute person in the room. Medieval chroniclers, who weren't exactly known for their progressive views on women's capabilities, began noting Margaret's unusual influence with a mixture of admiration and unease. Margaret was learning that, in medieval politics, perception was reality. If people believed you had power, you had power. If they sensed weakness, they'd exploit it faster than a Black Friday shopper spotting a discount. she was also discovering something that would define the rest of her life. She was really good at this game. But games have consequences, and Margaret was about to discover that once you start playing medieval politics at the highest level, the stakes become existential. There's no retirement plan in the monarchy business. You either win everything or lose everything, including your head. And with York watching every move she made, Margaret was about to face her first real test of whether she could translate political theory into survival reality. Here's a fun fact your history teacher probably skipped. The moment Margaret of Anjou stopped trying to be a good queen and started acting like an actual ruler, half of England collectively lost their minds, because apparently there's nothing more terrifying to medieval men than a woman who refuses to stay in her lane. Let's set the scene. It's 153. Henry II has been mentally absent for over a year, and Parliament is debating whether Richard of York should become regent. Margaret is watching this unfold while holding her newborn son Edward, the future of the Lancastrian dynasty, and she's had enough of watching other people decide her family's fate. The traditional queenly response would have been to smile, curtsy and defer to the men in the room. Margaret's response was essentially, "Hold my crown, I've got a kingdom to save," and thus began her transformation from French princess to English political powerhouse, earning her the nickname that would follow her through history, the She-Wolf. Now, before you start thinking medieval people were being dramatic with their animal metaphors, let me explain what she-wolf meant in 1450s England. This wasn't just calling someone aggressive. This was invoking images of a creature that would tear apart anyone who threatened her cubs, hunt in packs, and show no mercy to enemies. In a society where women were expected to be gentle lambs, being called a wolf was both an insult and a grudging acknowledgement of terrifying competence. Margaret's first major power play came during Henry's mental breakdown. While York positioned himself as the obvious regent choice, Margaret quietly built a coalition that would make modern political operatives weep with envy. She understood something that York, for all his noble breeding, had missed. Politics isn't just about who has the strongest claim, it's about who can make the strongest alliances. She started with Somerset, who had his own reasons to keep York away from power. Then she reached out to other noble families who felt threatened by York's growing influence. Margaret wasn't just building political support, she was constructing a network of mutual interest that would survive longer than any single crisis. It was medieval politics at its finest, complicated, personal, and absolutely ruthless. But Margaret's real masterstroke came when Henry finally recovered from his mental absence in late 1454. Instead of allowing York to maintain his regency, she orchestrated a complete reversal of power. Somerset was released from the Tower of London, where York had imprisoned him, and restored to his former position. York found himself suddenly excluded from the inner circle he dominated for 18 months. Think about the sheer audacity of this move. Margaret had essentially staged a palace coup while maintaining the fiction that she was simply helping her recovered husband resume his duties. She'd outmaneuvered one of the most powerful nobles in England, secured her son's position as heir, and demonstrated that she could play political chess at the highest level. And she'd done it all while maintaining the appearance of proper queenly behaviour. The English nobility's reaction was, well, imagine a group of professional poker players discovering that the quiet person in the corner had been counting cards the entire time. There was admiration, there was fear, and there was a growing realization that they'd seriously underestimated the French princess. Contemporary chronicles from this period show a fascinating shift in how Margaret was perceived. Early accounts describe her as beautiful, pious, and properly deferential, standard queen behaviour. But by 1454, chroniclers are using words like resolute, determined, and fierce. One particularly memorable account describes her as having the heart of a man in the body of a woman, which was medieval code for holy shit, she's actually competent. Margaret's transformation wasn't just political. It was personal. The shy 15-year-old who'd arrived from France had been forged by necessity into something harder. She'd learned that in a world where showing weakness meant death, strength wasn't just an option. It was a survival strategy, and she was getting very good at survival. But here's where Margaret's story takes a darker turn. Because medieval politics operated on the principle that every action required an equal and opposite reaction, York wasn't about to accept his political exile quietly, and Margaret's success in outmaneuvering him had consequences that would echo through decades. The phrase, she-wolf, started appearing in chronicles and letters with increasing frequency. It wasn't always meant as an insult. Sometimes it carried grudging respect, but it marked Margaret as something new and dangerous in English politics. She wasn't playing by the traditional rules of queenship, and that made her unpredictable. What makes Margaret's rise particularly fascinating is how she managed to accumulate real power while maintaining the fiction that she was simply supporting her husband's reign. She attended council meetings, influenced appointments, and made decisions that affected the entire kingdom, all while technically having no official authority beyond being Henry's wife. It was a masterclass in political theatre. Margaret understood that medieval society wasn't ready for a queen who openly ruled in her own right. So she created a system where she wielded real power through carefully maintained channels. She was essentially running a shadow government while letting Henry remain the public face of authority. But shadows have a way of becoming visible when the light shifts. And Margaret was about to discover that once you've been marked as dangerous, your enemies start taking precautions. The game was about to change from political maneuvering to actual warfare, and the she-wolf was about to learn that metaphorical teeth sometimes need to become literal ones. Let that sink in for a moment. We're watching the birth of a woman who would spend the next 20 years proving that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimated. You know how some family arguments escalate from who ate the last cookie to I'm never speaking to you again? Well, imagine that dynamic, but instead of cookies, we're talking about the Crown of England. And instead of silent treatment, the consequences involve actual armies trying to kill each other. Welcome to the Wars of the Roses, where Margaret of Anjou was about to learn that political disputes in medieval England were settled with significantly more bloodshed than a modern Twitter feud. The First Battle of St. Albans in May 1455 wasn't supposed to be the beginning of a 30-year civil war. It was supposed to be a tense political standoff that might involve some posturing and angry letters. Instead, it became the medieval equivalent of accidentally starting World War III, because someone took the last parking space. Here's what happened. Richard of York, tired of being politically sidelined by Margaret's manoeuvring, decided to march south with an army to rescue Henry VI from his evil advisors. It was the medieval version of an intervention, except instead of concerned family members, York brought several thousand armed men and a grudge list that read like a medieval hit parade. Margaret, meanwhile, was learning her first crucial lesson about medieval warfare. Sometimes diplomacy fails, and when it does, you'd better hope your side brought more swords. She watched from the sidelines as her carefully constructed political coalition was about to face its first real test against actual violence. The battle itself was less epic medieval warfare and more bloody street fight that got out of hand. It lasted maybe an hour, but in that hour, the entire political landscape of England was rewritten in blood. Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, Margaret's key ally, and the man she'd worked so hard to restore to power, was killed. Not captured, not wounded, but actually dead, with a Yorkshire sword through his chest. Let me pause here so you can appreciate what this meant for Margaret. Somerset wasn't just a political ally, he was the cornerstone of her entire power structure. His death was like watching the foundation of your house collapse while you're still inside. Everything she'd built over the previous 2 years was suddenly in ruins, and York was standing over the wreckage with a bloody sword and a smile. But here's where Margaret began to earn her reputation as the she-wolf. Because her response to this devastating loss wasn't despair or retreat, it was rage, cold, calculating, absolutely implacable rage that would fuel 20 years of civil war and establish her as one of the most formidable opponents York would ever face. Henry VI, as predictably, was useless in this crisis. After the battle, he was found sitting under a tree, apparently having suffered another mental episode triggered by the violence around him. York found him there, helped him to his feet, and escorted him back to London in what was essentially a very polite kidnapping. Henry was once again under York's control, and Margaret had to watch her husband being led away like a confused child. This is the moment. And I want you to really think about this, when Margaret of Anjou stopped being a queen and became a warlord, because that's essentially what she was about to become, a military commander who would spend the next 2 decades raising armies, fighting battles, and proving that she could play the game of medieval warfare better than most of the men who'd been born to it. The immediate aftermath of St. Albans was a masterclass in political theatre. York became protector of England again. Henry was restored to his throne, while remaining completely under York's influence, and Margaret was expected to smile and accept that her political network had been decapitated. The traditional queenly response would have been to retreat to her chambers and focus on embroidery until the men sorted things out. Margaret's actual response was to start building an army. She began in the north, where the Percy family, traditional enemies of York, were more than happy to support anyone who wanted to put a sword through Yorkshire ambitions. Margaret didn't just seek their support, she cultivated it, building relationships that would prove crucial in the battles to come. She was learning that in medieval politics, your enemy's enemies really could become your friends, especially if you offered them a chance to settle old scores. What makes Margaret's transformation during this period so remarkable is how quickly she adapted to thinking in military terms. This was a woman who'd been raised in French court culture, where warfare was something men did while women wrote poetry about it. But necessity has a way of turning poets into generals, and Margaret was discovering she had a talent for strategic thinking that extended beyond political maneuvering. She also began building something that would become her signature throughout the Wars of the Roses, a reputation for absolute ruthlessness toward her enemies. Margaret wasn't interested in the chivalric codes that governed how noblemen were supposed to treat each other in defeat. She'd watched York kill her allies, and she was perfectly prepared to return the favour with interest. The period between 1455 and 1459 was like a very tense Cold War, where both sides built up their strength while maintaining the fiction that they weren't preparing for inevitable conflict. Margaret used this time to forge new alliances, secure financial backing, and learn everything she could about medieval military logistics, because she'd realized something that would define the rest of her career. If you want to survive in a world where political disputes are settled with swords, you'd better make sure your side has the sharpest blades. By 1459, Margaret had transformed from a displaced French princess into something England had never seen before, a queen who could field armies and wasn't afraid to use them. The she-wolf wasn't just awakening, she was sharpening her teeth, and York was about to discover just how dangerous an underestimated woman could become. Here's something they don't teach you in medieval history class. Raising an army in the 15th century was like organizing the world's most violent flash mob. Except instead of dancing, everyone brought weapons, and instead of disbanding after the event, they expected to be fed, paid, and led to victory. Margaret of Anjou was about to get a crash course in medieval military logistics that would make modern supply chain management look like child's play. By 1459, Margaret had spent 4 years learning the painful lesson that political power without military backing was like having a credit card with no actual money. It looked impressive until someone called your bluff. The Battle of Albans had taught her that in England, political disputes were ultimately settled at sword point, so she decided to become very, very good with swords. Let me paint you a picture of what medieval army building actually involved, because it's nothing like the movies. You couldn't just put out a recruitment poster and wait for volunteers. Medieval armies were complex political and economic arrangements that required managing everything from noble egos to peasant grievances to the basic question of who was going to pay for all those expensive horses and weapons. Margaret started with the Percy family in Northumberland, who had been nursing grudges against the Yorkists for generations. The Percys were perfect allies, wealthy, militarily capable, and absolutely committed to the idea that Richard of York deserved an unpleasant death. They brought not just their own forces, but their network of smaller northern nobles, who owed them loyalty and were looking for a chance to settle old scores. But Margaret's real genius was in understanding that medieval armies ran on more than just feudal obligation. They needed actual money. Soldiers expected pay, horses needed feed, and weapons required maintenance. Margaret began cultivating relationships with wealthy merchants and foreign allies, who could provide the financial backing necessary for sustained military operations. She was essentially creating England's first systematic approach to military crowdfunding. Her most important foreign connection was with Scotland. Now, asking the Scots for help against the English was like asking your ex's best friend to help you win them back. Technically possible, but requiring very careful negotiation. Margaret managed to secure Scottish support by promising them territorial concessions, and more importantly, by convincing them that a Yorkist victory would eventually threaten Scottish interests. It was diplomacy at its most pragmatic. My enemy's enemy is my friend, even if they've been trying to conquer me for centuries. What made Margaret's military education particularly impressive was how quickly she grasped the strategic importance of timing and positioning. Medieval warfare wasn't just about having the biggest army. It was about getting that army to the right place at the right time, with enough supplies to actually fight when they arrived. Margaret began studying the geography of England like a modern general studies satellite imagery, identifying key defensive positions and supply routes that would prove crucial in the campaigns to come. The Battle of Blore Heath in September 1459 was Margaret's first real test as a military commander, and it nearly ended her career before it began. Her forces, led by Lord Audley, were decisively defeated by a Yorkist army that demonstrated superior tactical coordination and battlefield experience. Audley was killed, Margaret's army was scattered, and she found herself facing the very real possibility that her military experiment had failed spectacularly. But here's where Margaret showed the resilience that would define her throughout the Wars of the Roses. Instead of being discouraged by defeat, she treated it as a learning experience. She analysed what had gone wrong. Poor coordination between different noble contingents, inadequate intelligence about enemy positions, and overconfidence in her force's abilities, and began making systematic improvements. Margaret's response to Blore Heath was to professionalise her military operations. She began recruiting experienced soldiers who could train her noble volunteers in actual battlefield tactics. She established better communication systems so her commanders could coordinate their movements. Most importantly, she started treating warfare as a skill that could be learned and improved, rather than something that noble birth automatically qualified you to do. The period following Blore Heath also saw Margaret developing her reputation for ruthlessness that would become legendary. Medieval warfare operated under certain chivalric conventions. Nobles were usually captured rather than killed, ransoms were paid, and there were protocols for how defeated enemies should be treated. Margaret looked at these conventions and decided they were suggestions rather than rules. Her reasoning was brutally practical. York and his allies had shown they were willing to kill her supporters, so she would return the favour. Margaret began making it clear that Yorkist nobles captured in battle might not survive long enough to pay ransom. It was psychological warfare designed to make her enemies think twice about the consequences of opposing her, and it worked remarkably well. By early 1460, Margaret had transformed herself from a political novice into a genuinely formidable military commander. She'd learned to think strategically about troop movements, understand the economic requirements of sustained warfare, and appreciate the psychological dimensions of medieval conflict. She'd also developed something that would prove crucial in the battles to come: a reputation for being absolutely unpredictable in her tactical decisions. What makes Margaret's military education so fascinating is how she adapted traditional feudal warfare concepts to her specific situation. As a woman commander, she couldn't rely on the traditional sources of military authority. She couldn't claim to be a great warrior herself, and many of her potential supporters were uncomfortable with the idea of following a female leader into battle, so she developed an alternative approach based on superior planning, better intelligence, and the strategic use of her enemies' own expectations against them. Margaret was learning that in medieval warfare, reputation could be as powerful as actual swords. If your enemies believed you were unpredictable, they'd spend more time preparing for multiple scenarios instead of focusing on their optimal strategy. If they thought you were ruthless, they'd worry about the consequences of defeat. And if they underestimated you because you were a woman, well, that was their mistake to make. Picture this. It's December 1460. Snow is falling across England like nature's own funeral shroud, and Margaret of Anjou is about to orchestrate a military victory so complete, so unexpected, and so absolutely brutal that it would make her enemies wake up screaming for the next decade. The Battle of Wakefield wasn't just a military engagement, it was Margaret's graduate thesis in medieval warfare, written in Yorkist blood. But let's rewind for a moment, because understanding what made Wakefield so significant requires appreciating just how desperate Margaret's situation had become by late 14th. Richard of York had spent the summer consolidating his power, and in October he'd done something that crossed every possible line. He'd openly claimed the throne of England for himself. Not as regent, not as protector, but as the rightful king. It was the medieval equivalent of your business partner suddenly announcing they owned your company, and you were fired. Henry II, predictably, was useless in this crisis. His response to York's claim was essentially to suggest they work something out through prayer and possibly a committee. Margaret's response was to start planning York's death with the methodical precision of someone organising a very violent wedding. The build-up to Wakefield was Margaret at her strategic best. She'd learned from her earlier defeats that medieval battles weren't won by the army with the most courage. They were won by the army with the best intelligence, superior positioning, and the element of surprise. Margaret spent weeks carefully manoeuvring her forces while allowing York to believe he held the tactical advantage. York had positioned himself at Sandal Castle near Wakefield, confident that his smaller force could hold a defensive position until reinforcements arrived. It was textbook medieval military doctrine. Find high ground, fortify your position, and wait for your enemies to exhaust themselves trying to dislodge you. The problem was that Margaret had read the same textbook, and she'd been making notes in the margins. What happened next was a masterclass in medieval psychological warfare. Margaret's forces began what appeared to be a standard siege, surrounding the castle and settling in for a prolonged engagement. York, watching from his battlements, saw exactly what he expected to see: an impatient enemy force that would eventually make a costly frontal assault against his prepared defences. What he didn't see was Margaret's real plan unfolding in the winter mist around him. Margaret had divided her army into multiple contingents that could coordinate their movements while appearing to be separate, unconnected forces. Some of her troops maintained the obvious siege positions, keeping York's attention focused on the main threat. Meanwhile, other contingents moved to cut off his potential escape routes and eliminate any possibility of reinforcement. She was essentially setting a trap with the patience of a spider and the cunning of a chess grandmaster. The psychological pressure on York was enormous. He was trapped in a castle with limited supplies, surrounded by enemies, and increasingly aware that his reinforcements weren't coming. Margaret had made sure of that by intercepting his messengers and spreading disinformation about her own troop strengths. York found himself playing a game where he didn't know the rules, couldn't trust his information, and was rapidly running out of good options. On December 30th, York made the fatal decision to sally forth from the castle. His reasoning was sound. Staying put meant slow starvation, while attacking might break the siege and allow his forces to retreat to a more defensible position. What York didn't realize was that Margaret had been counting on this exact decision. She'd constructed her siege specifically to make staying put seem impossible, while making attack seem like the only viable option. The battle itself was over, almost before it began. Margaret's forces, positioned and prepared for York's exact response, fell on his army like wolves on sheep. York found himself caught in the open with nowhere to retreat, facing enemies who seemed to know his every move before he made it. It was the medieval equivalent of bringing a knife to a gunfight, if the gunfight had been organized by someone who'd spent months studying exactly which knife you'd bring. Richard of York died on that battlefield, along with his son Edmund, and several of his key supporters. But here's where the story takes a turn that would define Margaret's reputation for the rest of her life. What happened after the battle was more shocking than the battle itself. In medieval warfare there were rules. Noble prisoners were taken alive, ransoms were negotiated, and defeated enemies were treated with a certain degree of respect, especially if they were related to royalty. Margaret looked at these rules and decided they didn't apply to traitors who'd tried to steal her husband's throne. York's head was cut off, mockingly crowned with a paper crown, and mounted on the gates of York City. His son Edmund received similar treatment. It was a message written in the clearest possible terms. This is what happens to people who challenge the House of Lancaster. Margaret wasn't just celebrating victory. She was advertising the consequences of defeat in terms so graphic that they'd be remembered for centuries. The psychological impact of Wakefield and its aftermath was enormous. Margaret had demonstrated that she could outfight, outthink, and absolutely outlast her enemies. She'd also shown that she was willing to abandon the chivalric conventions that had traditionally governed medieval warfare when it served her purposes. The she-wolf wasn't just winning, she was rewriting the rules of engagement. But victory, especially brutal victory, comes with consequences. Margaret had solved her immediate military problem by destroying York's army and killing its leadership. She'd also created a new problem. York had a son, Edward, who inherited both his father's claim to the throne and a very personal reason to see Margaret destroyed. The Wars of the Roses weren't ending at Wakefield. They were entering a new phase where the stakes had become existential and the methods had become absolutely merciless. Margaret had won the battle, but she'd also guaranteed that the war would continue until one side or the other was completely annihilated. You know that moment in chess when you think you've got your opponent in checkmate, only to realize they've been setting up a countermove that turns your victory into their comeback story. Margaret of Anjou was about to experience that feeling on a national scale, because killing Richard of York had solved one problem while creating another one. His 18-year-old son Edward, who was about to prove that revenge is a dish best served with superior military tactics and a really good claim to the throne. Fresh off her victory at Wakefield, Margaret should have been celebrating. She'd eliminated her primary enemy, secured her son's inheritance, and demonstrated to anyone thinking about challenging Lancastrian authority that she had both the military capability and the personal ruthlessness to make opposition a terminal career choice. Instead, she was about to learn that, in medieval politics, cutting off the head of the snake sometimes just made the snake angrier. Edward of York, now calling himself Edward V, because subtlety wasn't really his thing, had inherited more than just his father's claim to the throne. He'd also inherited a functioning military organization, a network of loyal supporters, and what contemporary chroniclers described as a burning desire for vengeance that made him significantly more dangerous than his cautious father had ever been. But Margaret had problems closer to home that required immediate attention. Her victory at Wakefield had been achieved with an army that included significant Scottish contingents, and those Scottish soldiers were now marching south through England, with all the discipline and restraint of a particularly rowdy bachelor party. Medieval armies lived off the land they marched through, which was a polite way of saying they stole everything that wasn't nailed down, and burned whatever they couldn't carry. The sight of Scottish soldiers looting English towns and villages was a public relations disaster for Margaret's cause. She'd spent years positioning herself as the defender of English interests against Yorkist usurpers. But now she was associated with foreign invaders who were treating English civilians like a mobile ATM with particularly poor security. It was the medieval equivalent of winning a political victory while accidentally live-streaming yourself committing war crimes. Margaret tried to maintain discipline among her forces, but medieval army management was like herding cats if the cats were armed, hungry, and had been promised payment that might not materialize for months. Her Scottish allies had crossed the border to help her win a war, not to practice good guest etiquette, and they expected compensation for their efforts in whatever form was available. Meanwhile, Edward V was proving that he'd learned from his father's mistakes. Instead of trying to fight Margaret's larger army in a direct confrontation, he focused on cutting off her support network and forcing her into increasingly desperate positions. Edward understood that Margaret's strength was also her weakness. Her reliance on Scottish and foreign support made her vulnerable to accusations of being a traitor to English interests. The Second Battle of St. Albans in February 1461 should have been Margaret's crowning victory. Her forces, larger and better positioned than Edward's, managed to defeat the Yorkist army in a tactical masterpiece that demonstrated everything she'd learnt about medieval warfare. Her commanders outmaneuvered the enemy. Her troops fought with disciplined ferocity, and the battlefield was littered with Yorkist casualties by the end of the day. Margaret had won another decisive military victory, but she'd also made a crucial strategic error that would haunt her for the rest of her life. After the battle, with London lying defenceless before her army, she hesitated. Contemporary accounts suggest she was concerned about the reception her Scottish heavy forces would receive from London's population, and she wanted to negotiate entry to the city rather than simply marching in as a conqueror. That hesitation gave Edward IV the opening he needed. While Margaret paused to consider her options, Edward raced to London, presented himself as the city's protector against Scottish invasion, and managed to get himself crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. Margaret had won the battle, but lost the political war, and Edward had turned her military success into his propaganda victory. The coronation of Edward V was a masterclass in medieval political theatre. Edward presented himself as the young, vigorous defender of English interests against foreign invasion and weak Lancastrian rule. He was tall, charismatic, and had the kind of natural leadership presence that made people want to follow him into battle. More importantly, he was male, English-born, and didn't arrive in the capital city with an army that had spent weeks looting the countryside. Margaret, watching from the sidelines as Edward claimed her husband's throne, must have felt like someone who'd spent years building a house only to watch someone else move in and change the locks. Everything she'd worked for, Henry's restoration, her son's inheritance, the political network she'd constructed through years of careful maneuvering, had been undone in a matter of weeks by a teenager with better public relations skills. But here's what makes Margaret's story so compelling. Instead of accepting defeat, she decided to treat Edward's coronation as a temporary inconvenience. The she-wolf had been backed into a corner, which, historically speaking, is when wolves are at their most dangerous. Margaret wasn't ready to give up her crown without a fight, and she'd already proven that she was very good at fighting. Edward V might have won London and claimed the throne, but Margaret still controlled significant military forces and had allies who were more than willing to continue the war. The coronation wasn't the end of the Wars of the Roses. It was just the beginning of a new phase where Margaret would have to prove whether her reputation for ruthlessness could overcome Edward's advantages in youth, charisma, and timing. The game had changed, but the she-wolf was still playing, and she had 20 years of experience in turning disadvantages into opportunities. Edward I was about to discover that claiming a throne and keeping it were two very different challenges. There's something uniquely humiliating about going from Queen of England to person who needs to ask permission to cross borders in the span of a few months. Margaret of Anjou was about to get a crash course in medieval refugee politics that would make modern immigration processes look like a luxury vacation, complete with the kind of bureaucratic humiliation that makes you question everything you thought you knew about royal privilege. After Edward IV's coronation and the catastrophic Battle of Towton in March 1461, where Margaret's forces were decisively defeated in what was essentially medieval England's bloodiest day ever, she found herself in the uniquely awkward position of being a queen without a kingdom, a general without an army, and a mother trying to protect a 7-year-old boy who was technically still heir to a throne someone else was currently sitting on. Margaret's escape to Scotland wasn't the dignified royal retreat you might imagine from medieval romance novels. It was more like a very expensive episode of Survivor, except instead of competing for a cash prize, she was trying to avoid having her head mounted on a spike next to her defeated supporters. She travelled with a handful of loyal followers, limited resources, and the growing awareness that royal titles don't translate into guaranteed foreign aid when your kingdom has just been conquered by someone younger and more militarily competent. The Scottish court's reception of Margaret was a masterclass in diplomatic awkwardness. On one hand, they were hosting the legitimate Queen of England and her heir, which carried certain prestige and potential future benefits. On the other hand, she was also a refugee who'd just lost a civil war, which made her more of a liability than an asset. It was like agreeing to let your friend crash on your couch, except your friend used to run a country and her enemies have really good armies. James III of Scotland was 9 years old, which meant Margaret was negotiating with regents who had their own complex political agendas. The Scottish nobility saw Margaret's presence as an opportunity to extract concessions from whoever eventually won the English throne. If she regained power, they'd have her gratitude. If Edward I consolidated his position, they could use her as a bargaining chip. Margaret found herself being treated less like a queen, and more like a very expensive poker chip in a game she couldn't control. But here's where Margaret began demonstrating the resilience that would define her exile years. Instead of wallowing in self-pity or accepting her reduced circumstances, she started treating exile as a temporary inconvenience that required strategic planning. She began cultivating relationships with European courts, building a network of potential allies who might support her eventual return to England. Her most important connection was with Louis XI of France, who had his own reasons for wanting to cause problems for Edward III. Louis was the kind of medieval politician who collected enemies' difficulties like other people collected coins, and Margaret represented a perfect opportunity to keep England internally divided and militarily distracted. Margaret understood this dynamic and played into it brilliantly, positioning herself not as a desperate refugee, but as a strategic asset in Louis's ongoing conflicts with Burgundy and other European powers. Margaret's negotiations with Louis were fascinating because they revealed just how much she'd learnt about international politics during her years as queen. She wasn't just asking for charity, she was proposing mutually beneficial arrangements where French support for her cause would serve French interests in weakening England and preventing Edward I from potentially aligning with France's enemies. The terms they eventually agreed upon were both generous and humiliating. Louis would provide Margaret with military and financial support for her eventual invasion of England, but in exchange she would cede the strategic port of Calais to France, essentially trading away one of England's most valuable overseas possessions for the chance to regain her throne. It was the medieval equivalent of mortgaging your house to fund a business venture, except the house belonged to an entire kingdom, and the business venture involved probable death for everyone involved. What makes Margaret's exile period particularly impressive is how she managed to maintain her political relevance while having no actual power base. She was essentially running a government in exile from foreign courts, keeping alive the Lancastrian claim to the throne through pure force of personality and strategic thinking. Medieval politics operated on personal relationships and reputation, and Margaret spent her exile years carefully maintaining both. She also used this period to give her son Edward the kind of political education she'd never received before her own marriage. The young prince learned languages, studied military tactics, and observed firsthand how international diplomacy actually worked. Margaret was preparing him not just to be a king, but to be the kind of king who could navigate the complex realities of medieval European politics without making the mistakes that had led to their current exile. Margaret's reputation during this period underwent another transformation. European courts began describing her not just as the she-wolf, but as one of the most formidable political operators of her generation. She'd survived military defeat, adapted to exile, and managed to build new alliances from a position of apparent weakness. Medieval chroniclers noted her indomitable spirit and relentless determination, with the kind of grudging admiration usually reserved for particularly successful military commanders. But Margaret's most impressive achievement during her exile was psychological. She never accepted that her situation was permanent. While other defeated medieval rulers often retreated into religious life or accepted their reduced circumstances, Margaret spent every day planning her return to England. She studied Edward IV's weaknesses, monitored English political developments, and waited for the inevitable opportunities that medieval politics always provided to patient and prepared players. By 1470, Margaret had spent nearly a decade in exile, but she'd used that time to become something England had never seen before, a queen who could think strategically on an international scale, maintain political networks across multiple countries, and plan military campaigns with the patience of a chess grandmaster. The she-wolf was about to return, and she'd learned some new tricks during her time away from home. Here's a plot twist worthy of the best political thrillers. The man who'd spent 15 years trying to destroy Margaret of Anjou was about to become her most important ally. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Kingmaker, because of his talent for putting people on thrones and taking them off again, was having a very public falling out with Edward I, and Margaret was about to discover that in medieval politics, your enemy's enemy really could become your best friend. Let me set the scene for what might be the most improbable alliance in medieval English history. Warwick was the power behind Edward IV's throne, the man who'd engineered the Yorkist victory and made Edward's coronation possible. He was also Margaret's sworn enemy, the architect of many of her military defeats, and someone who'd spent the better part of a decade trying to have her killed. Margaret, for her part, had excellent reasons to want Warwick dead, starting with his role in her exile and continuing through his general policy of supporting people who kept trying to steal her husband's throne. But by 1470, Edward I had made the classic mistake of successful politicians everywhere. He'd started believing his own press releases. Edward had grown tired of Warwick's influence, tired of being told what to do by the man who'd made him king, and tired of sharing power with someone whose ego was roughly the size of medieval France. The relationship between them had deteriorated from strategic partnership to barely concealed mutual loathing, and Warwick was discovering that kings once established don't always stay grateful to their kingmakers. The breaking point came over Edward's foreign policy and marriage choices, because apparently, even in medieval England, family arguments about who you're dating could escalate into civil war. Edward had married Elizabeth Woodville, a politically insignificant English widow, instead of making the strategic foreign marriage Warwick had arranged. It was the medieval equivalent of ignoring your business partner's advice and then publicly humiliating them at the company Christmas party. Warwick's response to this disrespect was characteristically dramatic. If Edward IV didn't want to be the kind of king Warwick could support, then perhaps it was time to find a different king. And who better than Henry VI, the man Warwick had spent years fighting against, but who was currently available, properly royal, and presumably grateful enough to be manageable. The negotiations between Margaret and Warwick were conducted through Louis XI of France, who was practically vibrating with excitement at the prospect of orchestrating this alliance. Louis understood that Warwick's defection from Edward IV's cause represented a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to destabilize England, and he was more than willing to play matchmaker between two people who'd been trying to kill each other for decades. Picture this meeting. Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf who'd spent 10 years in exile planning her revenge, sitting across from Richard Neville, the man who'd engineered most of her defeats and forced her from her throne. The tension in that room must have been thick enough to cut with a sword. Both of them knew they were natural enemies. Both of them also knew that their mutual hatred of Edward IV had created an opportunity neither could achieve alone. Margaret's conditions for the alliance were masterful examples of political negotiation under impossible circumstances. She would agree to work with Warwick, but her son Edward would marry Warwick's daughter Anne, cementing the alliance through blood and ensuring that any future Lancastrian restoration would include Warwick's family in the succession. It was brilliant. She'd turned a temporary military alliance into a permanent political partnership while securing her dynasty's future. Warwick agreed to the terms because he understood that his own political survival now depended on Henry VI's restoration. Edward III had made it clear that there was no path back to royal favour for the former kingmaker, which meant Warwick's only options were exile, death, or finding a new king to make. Margaret represented his best chance at regaining the power and influence he'd lost through Edward's ingratitude. The invasion they planned together was a masterpiece of coordinated medieval warfare, while Edward IV was distracted by rebellions in the north, rebellions that Warwick had secretly organised. Margaret and Warwick's forces landed in England with French support and began their march toward London. Edward, caught completely off guard by the alliance between his former ally and his old enemy, found himself facing a military situation he wasn't prepared for. What followed was one of the most dramatically successful invasions in medieval English history. Edward IV, faced with the prospect of fighting both Margaret's forces and Warwick's extensive network of English allies, made the strategic decision that would define the next phase of his career. He fled to Burgundy, essentially abandoning his throne rather than fighting for it against impossible odds. Margaret's restoration to power in October 1470 was everything she'd dreamed about during her decade in exile. Henry VI was released from the Tower of London, where Edward had kept him imprisoned, and Margaret found herself once again Queen of England. After 10 years of exile, defeat, and humiliation, she was back where she belonged, with her enemies scattered and her son positioned as heir to a secure throne. But medieval politics has a way of making today's triumph into tomorrow's disaster, and Margaret's restoration came with built-in complications that would soon become apparent. Warwick wasn't just an ally. He was also a rival for power within the Lancastrian government. Their alliance had been built on mutual necessity rather than mutual trust, and both of them understood that their partnership would last exactly as long as their interests aligned. More importantly, Edward IV was still alive, still had supporters in England, and was already planning his return from Burgundian exile. Margaret had regained her throne, but she'd also inherited all the problems that had led to her original defeat, plus some new ones created by the complex dynamics of her alliance with Warwick. The she-wolf was back, but the hunt was far from over. There's something profoundly tragic about getting everything you've ever wanted, only to discover that the world has moved on while you were away, and your dreams have become someone else's nightmares. Margaret of Anjou's restoration to the English throne in October 1470 should have been her greatest triumph. Instead, it became a masterclass in how quickly political success can transform into inevitable disaster when the foundation beneath it is built on quicksand and mutual distrust. Margaret returned to London after 10 years of exile, expecting to resume her role as the power behind Henry VI's throne, only to discover that England in 1470 was a very different place from the England she'd left in 1461. Edward V's reign had fundamentally changed English politics, creating new power structures, new loyalties, and new expectations about how monarchy should function. Margaret was essentially trying to reinstall an outdated operating system on a computer that had been upgraded beyond compatibility. Henry VI's restoration was both touching and deeply troubling. The man Margaret found when she returned to England was a shadow of the king she'd married 25 years earlier. A decade of imprisonment, political upheaval, and mental instability had left him even less capable of actual governance than he'd been during his original reign. Contemporary accounts describe him as confused, gentle, and completely disconnected from the political realities surrounding him. It was like trying to run a medieval kingdom with a king who existed more as a symbol than as an actual person. Warwick, meanwhile, had spent Margaret's absence consolidating his position as the real power in the restored Lancastrian government. He'd orchestrated the invasion, managed the political transition, and positioned himself as the indispensable architect of Henry's restoration. Margaret returned to find that her role as queen had been essentially bureaucratized. She could have the title and the ceremonial functions, but the actual decision-making would be handled by people who'd been present during the transition. The dynamic between Margaret and Warwick during the Restoration period was fascinatingly tense. They were allies who didn't trust each other, partners who were constantly maneuvering for advantage, and co-conspirators who both understood that their alliance was temporary and conditional. Medieval chroniclers noted the careful politeness of their public interactions, which was diplomatic code for they were plotting against each other while maintaining the fiction of cooperation. Margaret's most immediate problem was that she'd been absent during the crucial period when the Restoration government was being established. Warwick had filled key positions with his own supporters, created administrative structures that served his interests, and built relationships with foreign powers that positioned him as England's primary decision-maker. Margaret found herself in the awkward position of being queen in a government where the real queen was someone else. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Margaret, who'd spent her original reign accumulating power behind the scenes while maintaining the fiction that Henry VI was actually ruling, now found herself marginalized by someone using exactly the same tactics she'd perfected. Warwick had studied her methods and improved on them, creating a more efficient system for managing a mentally incapable monarch while excluding the inconveniently competent queen from actual authority. But Margaret's real problem wasn't Warwick, it was time. The Restoration government needed to consolidate its position quickly, build popular support, and prepare for Edward IV's inevitable return from exile. Instead, it spent crucial months navigating the complex power dynamics between Margaret's supporters, Warwick's faction, and the various English nobles who were hedging their bets by supporting whoever seemed likely to win. Foreign policy became a particular source of tension between Margaret and Warwick. Margaret's years in exile had given her a sophisticated understanding of European politics and strong relationships with foreign courts, particularly France. Warwick, however, had his own diplomatic agenda that sometimes conflicted with Margaret's international commitments. They found themselves pursuing contradictory foreign policies while trying to maintain the appearance of unified leadership. The most visible symbol of their strained alliance was the marriage between Margaret's son Edward and Warwick's daughter Anne. What should have been a celebration cementing their political partnership instead became a carefully choreographed performance where both families smiled for public consumption, while privately calculating how to minimize their dependence on their new relatives. Medieval marriages were always political arrangements, but this one felt more like a hostage exchange with wedding decorations. Margaret also discovered that popular opinion had shifted during her exile in ways that made her restoration politically complicated. Edward IV's reign, whatever its flaws, had been associated with military success, economic stability, and strong leadership. Margaret's return was associated with foreign intervention, internal division, and the return of the weak Lancastrian governance that had originally led to civil war. She was fighting not just against Edward IV's supporters, but against a general perception that Lancastrian rule meant chaos and incompetence. The administration of the Restoration government revealed just how unprepared they were for the practical challenges of medieval governance. Margaret and Warwick spent so much time managing their relationship with each other that they neglected the basic functions of royal administration. Tax collection suffered, judicial appointments were delayed, and foreign diplomats reported difficulty determining who actually had authority to make binding agreements on behalf of the English crown. By early 1471, it was becoming clear that the Restoration was failing not because of external pressure, but because of internal contradictions that made effective governance impossible. Margaret and Warwick were trapped in a partnership that neither could abandon, but neither could make work productively. They needed each other to maintain power, but their competing visions for how that power should be exercised made coherent policymaking nearly impossible. Margaret must have realized during this period that her greatest victory was also her greatest defeat. She'd regained her throne, but in doing so she demonstrated that Lancastrian government was inherently unstable and ineffective. The Restoration wasn't solving the problems that had led to the original Civil War, it was recreating them with additional complications created by the alliance with Warwick. The she-wolf had returned to her den, only to discover that someone else had been living there, and the neighborhood had changed beyond recognition. You know that sinking feeling when you're finally winning an argument, and then your opponent pulls out receipts that prove you've been wrong about everything? Margaret of Anjou was about to experience that sensation on a national scale, because Edward V was coming home from Burgundian exile, and he'd spent his time away learning from every mistake that had led to his original flight from England. March 1471 should have been a routine month in the restored Lancastrian calendar. Spring weather, administrative consolidation, and the general satisfaction that comes from successfully reclaiming your rightful throne from usurpers. Instead, it became the month when Margaret discovered that Edward V's exile hadn't been a defeat, so much as an extended strategy session with some very well-funded and militarily competent allies. Edward's return began with what appeared to be a small-scale landing in Yorkshire with a handful of supporters. Margaret and Warwick, monitoring the situation from London, initially treated it as a minor inconvenience that could be handled by local forces. After all, Edward was essentially starting from scratch. No army, limited resources, and facing a consolidated Lancastrian government that controlled most of England's major cities and fortifications. It looked like a desperate gamble by a defeated exile rather than the beginning of a systematically planned reconquest. That assessment was spectacularly wrong. Edward I had spent his Burgundian exile doing something that medieval political refugees rarely bothered with: learning from his mistakes. He'd analysed why his first reign had failed, identified the political and military errors that had led to his flight, and developed a comprehensive strategy for avoiding those problems during his restoration. Edward wasn't just coming back, he was coming back better. His first stroke of genius was understanding that his original support base in Yorkshire remained largely intact. The northern English nobles who'd supported his family's rise to power hadn't switched their loyalties to Henry VI so much as they'd accepted temporary defeat. When Edward landed at Ravenspur, claiming he was only seeking to reclaim his hereditary Duchy of York rather than the crown itself, local supporters began rallying to his cause with an enthusiasm that caught Margaret's government completely off guard. Margaret's response to Edward's landing revealed just how much the stresses of the Restoration had affected her strategic thinking. Instead of immediately mobilizing the full resources of the Lancastrian government to crush Edward's small force before it could grow, she hesitated, apparently hoping that local forces could contain the threat without requiring major royal intervention. It was the kind of cautious response that might have made sense if she'd been dealing with a normal medieval rebellion, but Edward IV wasn't normal. He was a proven military commander with a talent for turning small opportunities into major victories. Warwick, meanwhile, was discovering that his decade-long reputation as the kingmaker had created expectations he couldn't necessarily fulfill. His supporters expected him to demonstrate the same military brilliance that had originally put Edward on the throne, but Warwick was facing the awkward reality that his opponent had learned from their previous encounters and was no longer making the kinds of mistakes that had made him vulnerable to Warwick's tactical preferences. The speed with which Edward's small landing force transformed into a serious threat was breathtaking even by medieval standards. Within weeks he'd gathered enough support to move south toward London, and his army was growing with each day's march. English nobles who'd been hedging their bets during the Lancastrian Restoration suddenly decided that Edward's return looked more promising than Margaret's uncertain government. What makes Edward's 4071 campaign particularly impressive is how he managed to exploit the fundamental weakness in Margaret and Warwick's alliance: their mutual distrust. Edward understood that his opponents were allied by necessity rather than genuine cooperation, and he began making strategic moves designed to exacerbate the tensions between them. He spread rumours about Warwick planning to betray Margaret, while simultaneously suggesting to Warwick's supporters that Margaret was planning to marginalise the Earl once she felt secure on the throne. Margaret found herself facing a military crisis while dealing with a political partner she couldn't fully trust, and a government structure that hadn't had time to establish effective coordination between its various factions. Medieval warfare required rapid decision-making and unified command structures, but the Lancastrian Restoration government was built on compromise and careful power-sharing that made quick responses nearly impossible. The Battle of Barnet in April 1471 was where Margaret's restoration began its final collapse. Warwick, leading the Lancastrian forces against Edward's army, was killed in the fighting. Not captured, not wounded, but definitively dead on the battlefield. With Warwick's death, Margaret lost not just her primary military commander, but the entire political network that had made the restoration possible. Margaret's reaction to Warwick's death was characteristically pragmatic. She immediately began planning how to continue the war without him, but she was also dealing with the psychological impact of losing someone who'd been simultaneously her greatest enemy and her most important ally. Warwick's death meant that she was once again fighting alone against Edward III, except this time she was doing it with a government that had been designed around power-sharing rather than the kind of centralized decision-making that effective warfare required. Edward I's capture of London following Barnet was almost anticlimactic. The city opened its gates to him with the enthusiasm of people welcoming back a familiar authority figure after an extended period of uncertain governance. Henry VI was once again imprisoned in the Tower. Margaret found herself preparing for another exile, and Edward resumed his throne with the confidence of someone who'd just proven that his first reign hadn't been a fluke. But Margaret wasn't finished. The she-wolf had been backed into a corner before, and she'd proven remarkably good at fighting her way out of impossible situations. Edward III had won this round, but Margaret still had cards to play, including a son who carried the Lancasterian claim, and allies who were willing to continue the fight. The war wasn't over, it was just entering its final, most desperate phase. There's a moment in every desperate situation when you realize you're down to your last card, your back is against the wall, and your only options are surrender, or one final, all-or-nothing gamble that will either save everything or destroy it completely. Margaret of Anjou reached that moment in May 1471, and her decision to play her last card at the Battle of Tewkesbury would determine not just her own fate, but the future of the Lancastrian dynasty and the entire trajectory of English history. Margaret's position following Warwick's death at Barnet was strategically hopeless, but not quite politically impossible. She still had her son Edward, now 17 years old, and carrying the legitimate Lancastrian claim to the throne. She still had allies in Wales and the southwest who were willing to continue fighting against Edward I. Most importantly, she still had her own reputation as someone who never gave up, never accepted defeat, and had a talent for turning impossible situations into unexpected victories. But she also had problems that would have discouraged anyone with less determination or more common sense. Her primary military commander was dead, her government had collapsed, her husband was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and Edward I was systematically hunting down everyone who'd supported the Lancastrian restoration. Margaret was essentially trying to restart a civil war from scratch, while being actively pursued by the very competent military forces of someone who'd already beaten her twice. Her strategy for the campaign that would culminate at Tewkesbury was characteristically ambitious and completely insane. Margaret planned to march through hostile territory to reach Wales, where Jasper Tudor, Henry VI's half-brother, was raising forces on her behalf. Once in Wales, she would consolidate her remaining support, potentially gain reinforcements from French allies, and launch a new offensive against Edward IV from a secure base. The plan required marching a relatively small army across England while avoiding Edward IV's forces, reaching Wales before being intercepted, and successfully linking up with allies who might or might not still be in position to help. It was the medieval equivalent of trying to drive cross-country while being chased by police, except the police had horses, swords, and professional military training. Margaret's march toward Wales was a masterclass in medieval military logistics under impossible circumstances. She had to move fast enough to avoid Edward's pursuing forces while maintaining enough discipline to keep her army from disintegrating under pressure. Medieval armies were inherently fragile organizations that required constant management of everything from food supplies to morale, and Margaret was trying to hold hers together while conducting what was essentially a running retreat across hostile territory. The psychological pressure on Margaret during this campaign must have been enormous. She was carrying the entire future of the Lancastrian cause on her shoulders, while dealing with the daily reality that every mile they travelled brought them closer to either salvation or complete disaster. There was no middle ground. Either they would reach Wales and continue the fight, or they would be caught and destroyed by Edward's forces. Edward I, meanwhile, was demonstrating the military competence that had made him king in the first place. Instead of simply chasing Margaret's army, he positioned his forces to cut off her route to Wales, while maintaining pressure that prevented her from stopping to rest and reorganize. Edward was fighting this campaign like someone who understood that this was his chance to end the Lancastrian threat permanently, and he wasn't about to let Margaret escape to fight another day. The convergence of forces at Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471, was inevitable, given the strategic geometry of Margaret's retreat and Edward's pursuit. Margaret found herself trapped in a position where she couldn't continue toward Wales without fighting through Edward's army, couldn't retreat without abandoning her strategic objectives, and couldn't remain stationary without allowing Edward to choose the terms of engagement. Margaret's decision to fight at Tewkesbury was both strategically necessary and tactically desperate. Her army was exhausted from the march, outnumbered by Edward's forces, and positioned in terrain that didn't favour their tactical preferences. But she also understood that this might be her last opportunity to achieve the kind of decisive victory that could restart the Lancastrian cause. If she could defeat Edward I in battle, kill or capture him, and restore Henry VI to active rule, the entire political situation could be reversed in a single afternoon. The battle itself was a disaster for Margaret's forces from the very beginning. Edward IV had learned from his previous encounters with Lancastrian armies, and he'd positioned his troops to exploit the weaknesses in Margaret's formation while minimizing her tactical advantages. Medieval battles could be decided by small margins: the right cavalry charge at the right moment, superior positioning, or simply better coordination between different units. And Edward had superior resources in all these areas. But the real catastrophe wasn't just the military defeat. It was what happened to Margaret's son during the fighting. Prince Edward, the 17-year-old heir to the Lancastrian dynasty, was killed during the battle, not captured, not wounded, but dead on the battlefield, taking with him not just Margaret's personal hopes as a mother, but the entire future of the Lancastrian claim to the English throne. Margaret's capture after Tewkesbury marked the end of more than just a battle. It marked the end of an era. For 30 years she had been the driving force behind Lancastrian resistance to Yorkist rule. She'd survived exile, military defeat, political marginalization, and personal tragedy, while maintaining her commitment to her husband's restoration and her son's inheritance. With Prince Edward's death, that entire struggle had been rendered meaningless. The she-wolf had finally been brought to bay, but even in defeat, she demonstrated something that would echo through English history, that royal women could be as formidable, as ruthless, and as politically sophisticated as their male counterparts. Margaret had lost everything, but she'd also proven that queens could be warriors, and that underestimating determined women was a mistake that could cost kingdoms. Imagine spending 3 decades fighting for everything you believe in: your husband's throne, your son's inheritance, your own survival, only to discover that victory was always impossible, and defeat was always inevitable. Margaret of Anjou's captivity after Tewkesbury wasn't just imprisonment. It was a forced meditation on the futility of human ambition and the cruel mathematics of medieval politics, where even the most brilliant strategies eventually succumbed to superior resources and better luck. Margaret's initial imprisonment was almost anticlimactic after the dramatic intensity of the previous months. Edward I, having finally eliminated the Lancastrian threat, found himself in the awkward position of holding captive a woman who'd been his most formidable enemy for over a decade. Medieval protocol for dealing with defeated royal opponents was surprisingly unclear. You couldn't simply execute a queen without significant political consequences, but you also couldn't release someone who'd spent their entire adult life trying to overthrow your government. The Tower of London, where Margaret was held, had become something of a family reunion of defeated Lancastrians. Henry VI was there, having been re-imprisoned after Edward's restoration, though his mental condition had deteriorated to the point where he was more of a symbolic prisoner than an actual threat. Seeing her husband in captivity, confused, gentle, and completely disconnected from political reality, must have been both heartbreaking and grimly ironic for Margaret. She'd spent 25 years fighting to preserve his reign, only to discover that the man she'd been defending had essentially ceased to exist as a functional person years earlier. Henry's death in the Tower, on May 24, 1471, officially attributed to melancholy, but widely suspected to be murder, marked the end of Margaret's role as queen consort, and the beginning of her identity as something much more complex, a living symbol of dynastic failure and personal tragedy. With both her husband and son dead, Margaret was no longer fighting for anyone's restoration, except possibly her own dignity. What makes Margaret's captivity particularly fascinating is how she used the enforced inactivity to process the events of the previous 3 decades. Medieval imprisonment wasn't the solitary confinement we might imagine. High-status prisoners often had access to books, visitors, and correspondence, which meant Margaret had opportunities for intellectual engagement that she'd rarely had time for during her active political years. Contemporary accounts suggest that Margaret used her imprisonment to write extensively, though most of her papers from this period haven't survived. We can only imagine what those writings contained: reflections on the nature of power, analyses of the political mistakes that had led to Lancastrian defeat, or perhaps simply attempts to make sense of a life that had transformed from fairy tale princess to warrior queen to defeated prisoner in the span of 30 years. Margaret's relationship with Edward I during her captivity was surprisingly complex. Edward had spent 15 years fighting against her, but he'd also developed a grudging respect for her political abilities and personal resilience. Medieval chronicles note that Edward treated Margaret with considerably more courtesy than was typical for defeated enemies, perhaps recognizing that her imprisonment was punishment enough without additional humiliation. The question of what to do with Margaret long-term created diplomatic complications that Edward hadn't anticipated. She remained technically a member of the French royal family through her father René of Anjou, which meant that mistreating her could create problems with France. Louis XI had his own reasons for wanting Margaret's release, not because he particularly cared about her welfare, but because her continued imprisonment served as a reminder of French involvement in English civil wars that Louis preferred to forget. Margaret's negotiations for her release became a masterclass in medieval diplomacy. Conducted from a position of complete powerlessness, she couldn't offer Edward anything he wanted, since she'd lost everything she'd once possessed. Instead, she had to convince him that her continued imprisonment was more trouble than her release would be worth. It was the ultimate exercise in making weakness look like strength through superior strategic thinking. The terms of her eventual release in 1475 were both generous and devastating. Edward I agreed to let her return to France in exchange for her formal renunciation of all claims to English titles and properties. Margaret would be free, but she would also be permanently exiled from the country she'd called home for 30 years, and stripped of the identity that had defined her adult life. What must have been particularly painful for Margaret was the realization that her release was possible precisely because she was no longer dangerous. Edward I could afford to be magnanimous toward a middle-aged woman with no remaining political base, no surviving heirs, and no realistic prospect of mounting another challenge to Yorkist rule. Her freedom was a testament to her complete political irrelevance. Margaret's departure from England in 1475 marked the end of one of the most remarkable political careers in medieval history. She'd arrived as a 15-year-old French princess, expecting a conventional royal marriage, and she was leaving as a 55-year-old woman who'd redefined what it meant to be a queen in an age when female political authority was theoretically impossible. The journey back to France must have been surreal for Margaret, retracing in reverse the path she'd taken 30 years earlier, as a young bride full of hopes for her future as Queen of England. Now she was returning to a country that had changed as dramatically as she had, carrying nothing but her memories and her reputation as the she-wolf who'd nearly brought down the House of York through sheer determination and political genius. But Margaret's story wasn't quite finished. Her return to France would reveal whether the skills that had made her one of medieval Europe's most formidable political operators could be adapted to the very different challenge of rebuilding a life after losing everything that had once defined her identity. The she-wolf was about to discover whether queens could learn to be ordinary people, or whether some transformations were permanent and irreversible. There's something uniquely disorienting about returning to a place you once called home, only to discover that 30 years of absence have transformed both the place and yourself into something unrecognizable. Margaret of Anjou's return to France in 1475 wasn't a homecoming so much as an introduction between strangers. One was the middle-aged woman who'd survived 3 decades of English civil war, and the other was a country that had moved on without her, and wasn't quite sure what to do with the legendary she-wolf who'd suddenly appeared on their doorstep. Margaret's reception in France was complicated by the fact that she'd become more famous for her English political career than she'd ever been as a French princess. The shy 15-year-old who'd left for her English marriage in 1445 had been a minor figure in French court politics, one of many royal daughters used to cement diplomatic alliances. The woman who returned in 1475 was Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf, whose reputation for political ruthlessness and military competence had spread throughout medieval Europe. Louis XI's attitude toward Margaret was particularly complex. On one hand, she was family, the daughter of his ally René of Anjou, and a woman who'd served French interests during her English campaigns. On the other hand, she was also a reminder of failed French interventions in English politics, and a potential source of diplomatic complications with Edward IV, who'd proven surprisingly effective at maintaining peaceful relations with France when he wasn't being invaded by French-backed pretenders. Margaret's financial situation was precarious in ways that must have been psychologically devastating for someone who'd once controlled the resources of the English crown. Her father René had died in 1480, leaving her with a small inheritance that provided basic support, but nothing approaching the wealth she'd once commanded as Queen of England. She was essentially living on what amounted to medieval social security, sufficient for dignity, but insufficient for political influence. What makes Margaret's French period particularly poignant is how she struggled to find a meaningful role in a society that had no clear place for someone with her unique qualifications. Medieval France had plenty of noble widows and displaced royalty, but it had never dealt with a woman who'd spent 30 years as the primary political and military strategist for a foreign kingdom. Margaret's skills in army management, international diplomacy, and strategic planning were remarkable, but they weren't easily transferable to the relatively peaceful life of a French court pensioner. Contemporary accounts from Margaret's French period describe her as maintaining an almost obsessive interest in English political developments. She followed news from England with the intensity of someone tracking investments in a company she'd once owned, analysing Edward IV's policies and speculating about potential weaknesses in Yorkist rule. It was the behaviour of someone who'd never quite accepted that her English political career was permanently finished. Margaret's relationship with the French court was also complicated by generational changes that had occurred during her English years. The courtiers who remembered her as Renee of Anjou's daughter were ageing or dead, replaced by younger nobles who knew her primarily through reputation and second-hand stories. She was simultaneously too famous to ignore and too politically irrelevant to take seriously, a living legend whose legendary status came from activities that were no longer relevant to current French politics. The most tragic aspect of Margaret's French period was how her legendary status as the she-wolf actually worked against her efforts to build meaningful relationships. People expected her to be fierce, ruthless, and politically calculating, which made normal social interactions difficult when what Margaret probably needed most was simple human connection after decades of treating every relationship as a potential political alliance or threat. Margaret's attempts to involve herself in French politics were gently but firmly discouraged by Louis XI and his successors. They appreciated her expertise and valued her insights, but they also understood that Margaret's involvement in French governmental affairs could create the impression that France was harbouring someone who might eventually challenge Edward I's rule. It was safer for everyone if Margaret remained a respected but politically inactive member of the extended royal family. What Margaret did during her long French retirement remains somewhat mysterious, largely because she'd become much less historically significant once she stopped being politically dangerous. Medieval chroniclers were interested in her when she was raising armies and fighting battles. They paid much less attention to her daily life as a French court pensioner. We know she maintained correspondence with various European courts, received visitors, and apparently spent considerable time reading and writing, but the details of her day-to-day existence have largely been lost to history. Margaret's psychological adaptation to her reduced circumstances reveals something remarkable about her character. After spending 30 years in situations where every decision carried life or death consequences, she somehow managed to transition to a life where her biggest concerns were probably social obligations and household management. It was a transformation that required abandoning the intensity that had defined her political career while somehow maintaining enough of her core identity to remain recognizably herself. The gradual fading of Margaret's historical visibility during her French period is both natural and deeply sad. She'd been one of the most politically significant women of her generation, someone whose decisions had shaped the course of English history, and she was slowly becoming just another elderly French noblewoman whose past achievements were more interesting than her present activities. But Margaret's French period also represents something remarkable, proof that people can survive the complete collapse of everything they've worked for, and still find ways to build meaningful lives from the wreckage. The she-wolf had learned to live without a pack, without territory to defend, and without enemies to fight. It was perhaps her most impressive transformation yet, from legendary political operator to ordinary person, carrying her extraordinary past quietly into an increasingly ordinary present. Margaret had spent her life proving that queens could be warriors. Now she was proving that warriors could learn to be simply human. Every story ends, but some endings feel more like periods at the end of incomplete sentences than satisfying conclusions to epic narratives. Margaret of Anjou died on August 25, 1482, in her small French estate, surrounded not by the armies and courtiers who defined her active political years, but by the quiet domesticity that had filled her final decade. It was an ending that somehow managed to be both peaceful and profoundly anticlimactic for someone whose life had been defined by constant crisis and dramatic intensity. The circumstances of Margaret's final years were almost aggressively ordinary after the extraordinary drama of her English period. She lived in modest comfort on her small inheritance, maintained correspondence with friends and relatives across Europe, and apparently spent considerable time reading and writing. Medieval chroniclers, who'd once tracked her every move as a matter of international significance, barely mentioned her during these final years. The she-wolf had become so successfully domesticated that she'd essentially disappeared from historical attention. What makes Margaret's death particularly poignant is how completely separated it was from the political developments that had once consumed her life. Edward I had died the previous year, plunging England into another succession crisis as his young sons disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and his brother Richard III claimed the throne. The kind of political chaos that had once represented opportunity for Margaret was now happening without her involvement or even her presence. The Game of Thrones was continuing, but she was no longer a player. Margaret's exclusion from the political turbulence following Edward I's death wasn't just geographical, it was generational. The English nobles who might have considered supporting a Lancastrian restoration were either dead, had made their peace with Yorkist rule, or were backing Henry Tudor, whose claim to the Lancastrian inheritance was considerably more distant than Margaret's had been, but who had the crucial advantage of being male, English, and actually present in the country. The rise of Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, represented both vindication and irrelevance for Margaret's life work. Tudor's victory at Bosworth in 1485, 3 years after Margaret's death, would restore Lancastrian rule to England, and validate Margaret's 30-year insistence that the House of York was a usurping dynasty that would eventually be overthrown. But Tudor's success also demonstrated that Margaret's personal involvement hadn't been necessary for Lancastrian restoration. Someone else could achieve what she'd spent her life fighting for, using different methods and different alliances. Margaret's will, probated after her death, reveals the modest circumstances of her final years, and provides some insight into how she viewed her own legacy. She left small bequests to various French religious institutions, personal items to friends and relatives, and what remained of her library to scholarly institutions. There were no grand political gestures, no attempts to influence English succession disputes, and no evidence that she saw herself as having any ongoing political role beyond the grave. What's most striking about Margaret's final testament is how thoroughly it divorced itself from her English identity. She signed herself as Margaret of Anjou, daughter of René, rather than using any of the English titles that had defined her adult life. It was as if she'd made a conscious decision to be remembered as French nobility rather than as the former Queen of England, perhaps recognizing that her English identity had become too associated with failure and tragedy to serve as a comfortable legacy. The reaction to Margaret's death across Europe was respectful but muted. She'd been famous enough that her passing warranted mention in various chronicles and diplomatic correspondence, but the responses were more ceremonial than substantive. Margaret had outlived her political relevance by enough years that her death felt more like the closing of a historical chapter than the loss of a significant contemporary figure. French court reaction to Margaret's death suggests that she'd been successful in her transition from political figure to private person. Contemporary accounts describe her as having been well liked during her final years, known for her intelligence, her interest in literature and scholarship, and her surprisingly gentle demeanor in personal interactions. The legendary she-wolf had apparently learned to be genuinely charming when she wasn't trying to overthrow governments or win civil wars. But Margaret's death also represented the end of something larger than her personal story. She'd been the last direct connection to the original Lancastrian dynasty that Henry V had established through his French conquests. With her passing, the medieval phase of English royal history, the period of weak kings, strong queens, and dynastic civil wars, was effectively concluded. The Tudors would bring different problems and different solutions to English governance, but they wouldn't face the specific challenges that had defined Margaret's era. The historical assessment of Margaret's life that emerged in the years following her death was remarkably balanced, considering the partisan nature of medieval chronicle writing. Even chroniclers who'd supported her Yorkist enemies acknowledged her intelligence, her political skills, and her remarkable resilience in the face of repeated defeats. The consensus seemed to be that she'd been formidable rather than admirable, someone whose abilities commanded respect even when her methods inspired criticism. Margaret's transformation in death from controversial political figure to historical curiosity began almost immediately. Writers who'd once treated her as a dangerous contemporary began presenting her as an example of medieval political complexity, someone whose career illustrated the broader tensions between traditional gender roles and political necessity that characterized 15th-century European governance. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to Margaret's legacy was how thoroughly her example had expanded contemporary understanding of what royal women could accomplish when circumstances required exceptional leadership. She hadn't just been an unusually competent queen, she'd redefined the role itself, proving that monarchical authority could be effectively exercised by women when they had sufficient intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking to overcome the institutional disadvantages of their gender. The she-wolf was dead, but she'd left behind a new understanding of what wolves could accomplish when they refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose on them. Margaret of Anjou had lost her kingdoms, her family, and ultimately her life, but she'd won something more permanent. Proof that extraordinary women could shape history through extraordinary determination, even when history seemed determined to destroy them in return. Here's the thing about being called the she-wolf for 500 years. Eventually, people start to wonder whether you earned that nickname through your actions, or whether history just couldn't figure out how else to describe a woman who refused to behave the way medieval society expected queens to behave. Margaret of Anjou's legacy is complicated, contradictory, and absolutely fascinating precisely because she spent 30 years proving that traditional categories for understanding royal women were completely inadequate for understanding her. The immediate historical impact of Margaret's career was undeniable. She'd fundamentally changed how English politics worked by demonstrating that queens could be effective military commanders, strategic thinkers, and political operators when circumstances required exceptional leadership. Before Margaret, English queens had been expected to provide heirs, look decorative, and occasionally intercede for mercy when their husbands were being particularly harsh. After Margaret, future queens would be judged by entirely different standards, not just for their ability to fulfill traditional roles, but for their capacity to handle genuine political authority when necessity demanded it. Margaret's influence on the Wars of the Roses extended far beyond her personal military campaigns. She'd essentially created the template for how dynastic civil wars would be fought in late medieval England, not as chivalric competitions between noble warriors, but as total political conflicts where survival required mobilizing every available resource and treating warfare as an extension of diplomacy rather than an alternative to it. The ruthless pragmatism that characterized the final phases of the Wars of the Roses owed much to Margaret's example of treating political enemies as existential threats rather than temporary opponents. But Margaret's most significant historical contribution might have been demonstrating that medieval government could function effectively under female leadership, when that leadership was competent and determined. Her periods of actual rule, both during Henry VI's mental absences and during her exile campaigns, proved that the institutional structures of medieval monarchy were adaptable enough to accommodate non-traditional power arrangements when political necessity made such arrangements unavoidable. The chroniclers who wrote about Margaret during her lifetime and immediately after her death struggled with how to categorize her within existing frameworks for understanding royal women. Traditional medieval gender roles provided vocabulary for describing good queens, pious, gentle, fertile, and bad queens, manipulative, ambitious, sexually transgressive. But Margaret didn't fit neatly into either category. She was undeniably ambitious and politically ruthless, but she was also defending her husband's legitimate reign and her son's inheritance, traditional queenly responsibilities that she was simply fulfilling through non-traditional methods. This categorical confusion led to the evolution of Margaret's historical reputation in ways that reveal as much about changing attitudes toward female political authority as they do about her actual career. Tudor historians, writing under a dynasty that included two highly effective female monarchs, were generally more sympathetic to Margaret's political activities than their medieval predecessors had been. They understood that circumstances might require queens to exercise authority that went beyond traditional gender roles, and they evaluated Margaret's career within that more flexible framework. Margaret's reputation as the she-wolf evolved differently in popular culture than it did in scholarly historical writing. Folk traditions and ballads emphasized her ruthlessness and military activities, while largely ignoring the political sophistication that had made those activities possible. Popular Margaret was a figure of almost mythical ferocity, a woman warrior who could lead armies and order executions with equal facility rather than the calculating political strategist who'd actually managed 30 years of complex international diplomacy while fighting multiple civil wars. The gendered nature of Margaret's historical reputation becomes particularly obvious when comparing contemporary descriptions of her political methods with descriptions of similar activities by male rulers. When Margaret ordered the execution of defeated enemies, chroniclers described it as evidence of unwomanly cruelty. When Edward IV did the same thing, it was presented as necessary political realism. Margaret's strategic alliances with foreign powers were characterized as treasonous collaboration with England's enemies, while male rulers' similar diplomatic arrangements were described as sophisticated international statecraft. Margaret's influence on subsequent English queens was both direct and subtle. Elizabeth I's famous declaration that she had the heart and stomach of a king echoed language that had been used to describe Margaret 2 centuries earlier, suggesting that Margaret had helped establish precedents for how female monarchs could claim traditionally masculine forms of political authority. The institutional arrangements that allowed Elizabeth to rule effectively as an unmarried female monarch owed something to the precedents Margaret had established for queens exercising independent political judgment. The international dimension of Margaret's legacy was equally significant. Her career demonstrated that medieval European politics were sophisticated enough to accommodate female diplomatic and military leadership when that leadership was effective enough to command respect from foreign courts. Margaret's relationships with Louis XI of France and James III of Scotland were conducted on terms of equality that would have been impossible for a queen who confined herself to traditional ceremonial roles. Modern historical scholarship has been kinder to Margaret than medieval or early modern accounts, largely because contemporary historians have better frameworks for understanding the structural constraints that limited her options, while appreciating the creativity with which she worked within those constraints. Feminist historians in particular have emphasized how Margaret's career reveals the gap between medieval theoretical limitations on female political authority and the practical reality that competent women could exercise substantial power when circumstances made such exercise necessary. But perhaps Margaret's most enduring legacy is simply the expansion of historical imagination that her career represents. Before Margaret, it was difficult to conceive of medieval queens as primary political actors, rather than supporting characters in their husbands' reigns. After Margaret, such conceptions became not just possible, but necessary for understanding how medieval government actually functioned when traditional power structures proved inadequate to political challenges. Margaret had spent her life proving that extraordinary circumstances could produce extraordinary people, regardless of gender, and that institutional limitations on women's political authority were more flexible than medieval theory suggested. The she-wolf had died, but she'd left behind a world where future generations of royal women would have access to forms of political authority that Margaret herself had been forced to create through sheer determination and strategic brilliance. History remembers Margaret of Anjou as the she-wolf, but perhaps it would be more accurate to remember her as the woman who taught medieval Europe that wolves could be queens, and queens could be wolves, when survival required both ferocity and intelligence. So here we are, 17 chapters deep into the story of Margaret of Anjou, and you might be wondering why we've spent nearly 17,000 words dissecting the life of a medieval queen who died over 500 years ago. After all, this is supposed to be boring history, right? Except Margaret's story isn't boring at all. It's a masterclass in how individual human determination can reshape entire political systems, how gender roles are really just suggestions that exceptional people can rewrite when circumstances demand it, and how the most important historical lessons often come from people who refuse to accept the limitations their societies tried to impose on them. Margaret's relevance to our modern world isn't just academic curiosity about medieval politics. Her story is fundamentally about what happens when systems fail, and individuals have to decide whether to accept that failure or fight to create something better. Margaret arrived in England, expecting to play a traditional supporting role in someone else's political drama. But when that drama turned into a disaster, she didn't retreat to the sidelines. She rewrote the script and cast herself as the lead character. Think about the parallels to our contemporary political landscape. How many times have we watched traditional institutions prove inadequate to handle modern crises? How often have we seen established power structures fail to respond effectively to unexpected challenges? Margaret's career provides a blueprint for how individuals can step outside conventional roles to address systemic failures, especially when that requires challenging fundamental assumptions about who gets to exercise authority and how that authority should be used. Margaret's transformation from French prince-princess to English political operative to military commander to international diplomat demonstrates something crucial about human adaptability that transcends historical periods. She didn't have training for most of the roles she was forced to fill, but she had intelligence, determination, and the willingness to learn from mistakes while adapting her methods to changing circumstances. In an era when career paths are increasingly unpredictable and traditional job descriptions are becoming obsolete, Margaret's example of continuous reinvention feels remarkably contemporary. The gender dynamics of Margaret's story are particularly relevant to ongoing conversations about women's leadership and political authority. Margaret operated in a world where female political power was theoretically impossible, but she managed to exercise substantial authority for 3 decades by being too competent to ignore and too strategically valuable to dismiss. Her methods, building coalitions, managing complex relationships, thinking strategically about long-term consequences, are exactly the leadership skills that modern research suggests women often excel at when given opportunities to demonstrate them. But Margaret's story also illustrates the costs of being a pioneering woman in male-dominated fields. She was held to different standards than her male contemporaries, criticized for behaviors that would have been praised in men, and ultimately remembered more for her methods than for her achievements. The nickname She-Wolf was both tribute and insult, recognition of her effectiveness combined with discomfort about her refusal to conform to traditional feminine roles. Modern women breaking barriers in politics, business, and other traditionally masculine domains might recognize some familiar dynamics in Margaret's reception by her contemporaries. Margaret's approach to crisis management offers lessons that extend far beyond medieval politics. When faced with her husband's mental illness, she didn't just manage the symptoms, she restructured governmental systems to work around the problem while maintaining the fiction that normal operations were continuing. When military defeat threatened her family's survival, she didn't accept exile as permanent. She used it as an opportunity to build new alliances and develop alternative strategies. Margaret's career is essentially a case study in turning disasters into opportunities through strategic thinking and tactical flexibility. The international dimension of Margaret's activities also feels remarkably modern. She operated in a world where domestic politics were inseparable from international relations, where local conflicts had global implications, and where success required understanding complex networks of competing interests across multiple countries. Margaret's ability to navigate French court politics, Scottish diplomatic traditions, and English factional disputes simultaneously required the kind of multicultural political sophistication that's becoming increasingly necessary in our interconnected world. Margaret's legacy challenges some comfortable assumptions about historical progress and gender equality. We like to think that women's political opportunities have expanded steadily over time, but Margaret exercised forms of authority in the 15th century that wouldn't be available to women again for several hundred years. Her career suggests that historical change isn't always linear. Sometimes extraordinary individuals create possibilities that disappear when circumstances change, only to be rediscovered much later by different people facing different challenges. The question of how to evaluate Margaret's methods remains relevant to contemporary discussions about political ethics and effectiveness. Margaret was ruthless when she felt ruthlessness was necessary, pragmatic when idealism would have been fatal, and willing to make alliances with people she distrusted when those alliances served her larger goals. Her career raises uncomfortable questions about whether exceptional circumstances justify exceptional methods, and whether we judge historical figures by the standards of their time, or by timeless moral principles. But perhaps Margaret's most important modern lesson is about resilience, and the refusal to accept defeat as final. She lost everything multiple times: her throne, her husband, her son, her political base. And each time she found ways to continue fighting until fighting was no longer possible. Even her final years in French exile represented a kind of victory, proof that people can survive the complete collapse of everything they've worked for, and still find meaning in the wreckage. Margaret of Anjou died over 500 years ago, but her story continues to resonate because it's fundamentally about human potential under extreme pressure. She proved that individuals can reshape institutions when those institutions prove inadequate to contemporary challenges. She demonstrated that gender roles are more flexible than societies typically admit when exceptional people refuse to be limited by conventional expectations. She showed that intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking can sometimes overcome enormous disadvantages in resources and social position. The she-wolf earned her nickname through 30 years of refusing to accept limitations that others tried to impose on her. In a world where we're still debating women's capacity for political leadership, still struggling with institutional failures, and still learning how to adapt to rapid change, Margaret's example remains remarkably relevant. She may have been medieval, but she was never boring, and neither are the lessons her extraordinary life continues to teach us about the possibilities hidden within even the most impossible circumstances. And there you have it, the complete, unvarnished truth about Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf, who proved that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimated. If you enjoyed this journey through medieval political chaos, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that make history feel beautifully, brutally human, and remember, boring history is just history. Nobody's told properly yet.